In a land carved by grit and gunpowder, where justice was often just the will of the man with the fastest gun, a lone woman's world was shattered, not by a bullet, but by the desperate thud of a body against her door. Daisy Moore thought she had escaped her past in the quiet solitude of the Arizona Territory. But on a night when the sky wept, fury fate threw a dying outlaw at her feet. She had no way of knowing that the secret he carried would by dawn bring 200 Apache warriors to her doorstep, their voices a single thunderous cry for a justice that could only be paid in blood. This is the story of how one act of mercy ignited a war, and how love was forged in the fires of a three-way standoff between an outlaw, a healer, and an army sworn to vengeance. The wind in the Dragoon Mountains had a voice. Most days it was a lonesome whisper that snaked through the pine and scrub oak, a constant companion to Daisy Moore in her self-imposed exile. But on this late autumn afternoon, the whisper had grown into a mournful howl. The sky, a brilliant turquoise just hours ago, was now bruised a deep, angry purple along the western horizon. A storm was coming, a real gully washer, and Daisy was securing what little she owned against its fury. Her cabin, nestled in a small, defensible basin, was her fortress. Hewn from timber she'd helped cut herself 2 years prior, it was sturdy, pragmatic, and lonely, a reflection of the woman who inhabited it. At 26, Daisy had a resilience that was etched into the fine lines around her clear blue eyes. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from wielding an axe, tending her small garden, and dressing the game she hunted with a steady-aimed Winchester. She had come to this unforgiving land to forget a life in Boston, a life of soft hands and softer promises that had ended in betrayal and heartache. Here survival was the only promise that mattered. She'd just finished barring the shutter on the last window when the first fat drops of a rain began to fall, striking the packed earth with a sound like scattered pebbles. The temperature plummeted. Inside the fire in the stone hearth crackled a welcome retort to the rising gale. Daisy checked the load in the rifle resting by the door, a habit as ingrained as breathing, and settled into a chair with a worn copy of Shakespeare, a relic from her past life. The storm broke with the ferocity of a cornered beast. Rain lashed against the roof in solid sheets, and thunder cannonaded through the mountains, each clap powerful enough to vibrate through the floorboards and into her bones. It was in a momentary lull between thunderclaps that she heard it. It wasn't the cry of a mountain lion or the spooked whinny of a wild horse. It was a wet, heavy thud against the front of her cabin, followed by a groan that was almost stolen by the wind. Daisy froze her heart, hammering against her ribs. No one ever came out this far. Her nearest neighbor was a prospector named Gus McHenry, a half-day's ride away, and he was too cagey to be caught out in a storm like this. This was something else. Trouble. Her hand went to the Winchester, the cold steel, a familiar comfort. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against the rough-hewn wood. Over the roar of the wind, she heard it again, a pained, rasping breath. A man's breath. Her mind raced. It could be a posse, a band of outlaws, or worse. A lone woman was a beacon for the worst kind of men. The smart thing to do was to stay silent, to let the storm and the wilderness deal with whoever was out there. That was the law of this land, mind your own, and you might live to see another sunrise. But then came a third sound, a soft, desperate scrape of fingernails against the door, a plea without words. It was the sound of a life trying to hold on. The healer in her, the part of her she'd inherited from her physician father, warred with the hardened survivor. Compassion, she knew, was a dangerous currency in this territory. Damn it all, she muttered the curse, a soft puff of air in the tense silence. She slid the heavy bar from the door and cracked it open, an inch the rifle held ready. The wind tore at the opening, trying to rip the door from her grasp. Lying slumped against the wall, half submerged in a growing puddle of mud and rainwater, was a man. His face was a pale gash in the gloom, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. A wide, dark stain was spreading across his left side, a stain too dark to be just water. His horse, a magnificent black stallion with panicked eyes, stood a few feet away, its reins tangled in a thorny bush. The animal was favoring a leg, but it was the man who was in immediate danger. His eyes fluttered open, locking on her for a fleeting second. They were grey, the colour of the storm clouds, and filled with a universe of pain before they slid shut. With a final resigned curse at her own foolishness, Daisy swung the door wide open. The law of survival could go to hell. She wasn't going to let a man die on her doorstep. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Grunting with effort, she hooked her arms under his and dragged him across the threshold, the muddy trail he left on her clean-swept floor. A dark omen. She slammed the door against the storm and barred it, plunging the room back into the warm, firelit quiet. He was unconscious now. She knelt beside him, her practiced hands moving quickly. He wore the clothes of a rider who'd seen hard miles, worn leather dusty jeans and a gun belt, which she carefully unbuckled and set far out of his reach. His shirt was soaked, and when she tore it open, the wound was revealed. It was a bullet hole, ugly ragged and deep in his side. It wasn't bleeding as much as it should, which meant the bleeding was happening inside. He was burning with fever, his skin hot and clammy to the touch. Working by the light of the fire and a single oil lamp, Daisy became the woman she had once been trained to be. She fetched her medical kit, a leather satchel filled with tinctures, salves, clean linen, and surgical tools her father had insisted she take. For the next hour, the only sounds in the cabin were the howling storm, the crackle of the fire, and the man's shallow, ragged breaths as she cleaned the wound, probed for the bullet with trembling fingers, and finally blessedly extracted the flattened piece of lead. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey to staunch the bleeding and fight infection, then bound his torso tightly with clean linen. As she worked, she took stock of him. He was handsome in a rugged, dangerous way. A sharp jawline shadowed with stubble, a straight nose that had been broken at least once, and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was an outlaw. She had no doubt of it. His kind was written in the hard lines of his face and the raw power in his build. Once he was stable, she turned her attention to his horse. Donning a heavy oilskin cloak, she braved the storm again. The stallion was a fine animal, and after a gentle struggle, she managed to untangle its reins and lead it to her small, lean-to stable. As she was unsaddling the beast, her hand brushed against a heavy leather saddlebag. Curiosity, another dangerous impulse, got the better of her. She unbuckled the straps. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oil-stained canvas, was not gold, not money, but something far stranger. It was a small pouch, no bigger than her palm, made of tanned buckskin, and adorned with intricate beadwork of turquoise and jet. Feathers, one from a hawk, one from an eagle, were tied to its drawstring. It felt heavy, solid, and hummed with a strange, almost imperceptible energy in her hand. It was Native American, Apache by the look of the patterns. A cold dread, colder than the rain soaking through her cloak, seeped into her bones. This was no simple trinket. This was something sacred, something important. And men who carried things like this, men who got shot for them, did not bring peace. She quickly rewrapped the pouch, shoved it back into the bag, and finished tending to the horse. Back in the cabin, she looked at the unconscious man lying in her bed. He was just a wounded stranger. But the pouch in his saddlebag told a different story. She had not just saved a man from a storm. She had invited a whole new and infinitely more dangerous tempest into her home, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the soul that the reckoning would come with the dawn. The storm raged through the night, a wild symphony of wind and thunder that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Daisy's soul. She did not sleep. She sat in her chair by the hearth, the Winchester across her lap, watching the stranger. Every rasping breath he took was a countdown to a future she couldn't predict. She dragged a small cot for him near the fire, unwilling to put a potentially wanted man in her own bed. As the hours passed, his fever climbed. He tossed and turned, his body slick with sweat, his mind lost in a delirious landscape of memory and pain. He spoke, but his words were fractured, disjointed whispers that painted a dark picture. Blackwood. Damn your black heart. He muttered, his fists clenching at his sides. The stone. Not for you. Daisy leaned closer, straining to hear over the din of the storm. The name Blackwood meant nothing to her, but it was spoken with a venom that was unmistakable. Later he thrashed violently, his eyes wide and unseeing. Goyathle, I swear, I was bringing it back. His voice was raw with desperation. He quieted, then a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek before he collapsed back into a restless slumber. Goyathle. The name hit Daisy like a physical blow. It was not a name one heard lightly. While most settlers only knew the name Geronimo, those who lived closer to the land, who listened to the whispers on the wind, knew his true name, Goyathle. He was the formidable chief of the Chiricahua Apache, a man whose name was synonymous with fierce resistance and unwavering devotion to his people. A man you didn't cross. A man you certainly didn't steal from. The beaded pouch in the saddlebag suddenly felt 1,000 times heavier. Her hands trembling slightly, Daisy fetched the saddlebag and brought it inside. By the flickering lamplight, she unwrapped the pouch again. This time she opened it. Inside was not a collection of herbs or charms, as she might have expected. It was a single smooth, flat stone, a disk of what looked like sandstone. But it was the image carved into its surface that made her gasp. It was a sun, not the simple circle a child might draw, but an intricate spiral of rays emanating from a central point. And at that center was a small, perfectly round piece of turquoise, the color of a summer sky. It was beautiful, ancient, and radiated a palpable sense of power. A sunstone. A sacred object. Something a chief like Goyathle would guard with the lives of his warriors. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This man, this outlaw, had stolen a sacred artifact from the most powerful Apache chief in the territory. The bullet in his side was likely a parting gift from its guardians. And his delirious plea, I was bringing it back, what did that mean? Was it a fever-induced lie, or a truth more complicated than simple theft? She looked at the man on the cot. His face in repose seemed younger, less hardened. Was he a thief or something else entirely? A pawn in a game played by this man he called Blackwood. The questions were a hornet's nest in her mind. All she knew for sure was that she was now an accomplice. By helping him by holding this stone under her roof, she had tied her fate to his. The local law represented by a rarely seen sheriff in the town of Wilcox was the least of her worries. The Apache had their own laws, their own justice, and it was swift. Towards the hours before dawn, the stranger's fever broke. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, healing sleep. His breathing evened out, becoming stronger, steadier. Daisy felt a flicker of pride in her work, quickly extinguished by a wave of fear. A living man could answer questions. A living man could be held accountable. As the first, faintest hint of grey began to soften the eastern sky, the storm died as quickly as it had arrived. The wind quieted to a sigh, and the rain softened to a whisper, then ceased altogether. A profound, almost unnatural silence fell over the mountains. The air was washed clean, smelling of damp earth pine and ozone. Daisy went to the door and opened it. The world outside was transformed. The pre-dawn light cast everything in shades of silver and grey. Mist clung to the hollows, and every tree branch and rock glistened with a fresh coat of water. It was a scene of immense peace, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. But her peace was short-lived. As her eyes adjusted, she saw them. They weren't there one moment, and were the next, as if they had risen from the damp soil itself. On the ridge that overlooked her cabin, silhouetted against the nascent dawn, was a rider. Then another, and another. They fanned out, silent and implacable their forms, multiplying until the entire ridgeline was occupied. They were statues on horseback, armed with rifles and bows, their faces grim and unreadable from this distance. They made no sound. They didn't have to. Their presence was a shout, a verdict, a promise. Daisy's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to count them. She knew it was a war party, a large one. She slowly, deliberately backed into the cabin, her hand reaching not for the rifle this time, but for the sacred sunstone. She heard a stirring from the cot. The stranger was awake. His storm-grey eyes were open clear for the first time and fixed on her face. He saw the terror there and tried to push himself up. "What is it?" He rasped, his voice hoarse. Daisy didn't have to answer. From outside, a single voice rose clear and powerful in the clean morning air. It was a voice accustomed to commanding armies and shaping destinies. It was a voice that carried the weight of a people's grief and anger. The words were in the Apache tongue, but their meaning was universal, transcending language, understood in the gut and in the soul. It was the sound of justice being demanded. The stranger, the outlaw, closed his eyes. "Goyathle," he whispered. And it was not a curse or a plea, but a statement of fact. The reckoning had arrived. The world outside the cabin held its breath. The army of warriors on the ridge remained motionless, a living wall of judgment against the lightning sky. There was no war cry, no immediate charge. There was only the terrible patient silence of men who knew they held all the power. Daisy stood frozen in the center of the room, the sunstone clutched in her hand. Its smooth surface felt impossibly cold against her skin. The man on the cot pushed himself into a sitting position, his face pale and taut with pain. He winced a hand, going to his bandaged side. How many, he asked, his voice, low and steady, all traces of delirium gone. I can't count them all." Daisy stammered, her gaze fixed on the door, as if she could see through the wood. "The entire ridge? It has to be 200. Maybe more." He let out a slow breath, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "He never does anything by halves." He looked from Daisy's terrified face to the stone in her hand. "So you found it." "It was in your saddlebag," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He called for you. Goyathle. He's demanding justice." "Justice!" The man repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. "For them that means my scalp and that stone. And likely your scalp too for harboring me." The bluntness of his words sent a fresh chill through her. He was right. To the Apache, she was not a healer who had shown mercy. She was an ally to a thief who had committed a grave sacrilege. "My name is Samuel," he said, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "Samuel Kane. Daisy Moore." The exchange of names felt absurd under the circumstances, a polite formality on the edge of an abyss. From outside, the chief's voice boomed again, this time followed by a single sharp cry from the warriors on the ridge, a unified, chilling sound that was both a promise and a threat. "They're growing impatient," Samuel said, swinging his legs carefully over the side of the cot. He swayed, and Daisy instinctively moved to steady him. Her hand on his arm, she could feel the heat of his fever, still lingering, the tremor of weakness that ran through him. "You can't even stand," she said. "What do you think you're going to do?" "Negotiate," he grunted, trying to find his footing. "Or die trying. Better than waiting in here like a cornered rat. Negotiate with what they think you stole their most sacred object." That Samuel said, his eyes glinting with a defiant spark, is where things get complicated. Before he could elaborate, the front door of the cabin shuddered. Thump, the sound of a heavy war club striking the wood. It was a summons. "Stay back," Samuel ordered, his voice taking on a new tone of command. He pushed himself off Daisy gently and limped toward the door, his movements slow and agonizing. He leaned his shoulder against the wall for support. "What's your plan?" Daisy whispered, urgently grabbing the Winchester. Her fear was rapidly being replaced by a hot, defiant anger. This was her home. She wouldn't let it become a slaughterhouse without a fight. "Show them I'm not hiding," Samuel said. "Show them I'm not afraid. And pray they're willing to listen to a story." He reached for the wooden bar, his knuckles white. He paused, turned his head, and looked at her. For a moment the hardened outlaw vanished, and she saw only a man facing his own mortality. "Thank you, Daisy Moore," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it, "for patching me up. You should have left me in the rain." "It seems I'm about to pay for that mistake," she replied, her grip tightening on the rifle. "Open it." Samuel slid the bar away. The door swung inward on its leather hinges, flooding the dim cabin with the cold grey light of dawn. Framed in the doorway was a man who seemed carved from the very mountains around them. He was tall for an Apache, with a face that was a mask of stern authority, and deep-set, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. This was Goyathle. His hair, streaked with silver, was held back by a simple leather band. He wore no paint, no elaborate headdress. His power was in his presence, an aura of command, so potent it felt like a physical force. Flanking him were two warriors, their faces painted for battle, their expressions merciless. Behind them, stretching back from the cabin, the basin was now filled with dismounted warriors, forming a silent, lethal semicircle. Goyathle's eyes swept the room. They rested on Samuel, taking in his pale face and bandaged side with a flicker of contempt. Then they moved to Daisy, and his gaze hardened. Finally, his eyes locked on the sunstone in her hand. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest. "You have something that belongs to the people," Goyathle said. His voice was deep and resonant, and he spoke in surprisingly clear, if heavily accented English. "You harbor the desecrator who stole it. The woman will give me Aye's heart and step aside. We have come only for him." Aye's heart, the heart of the sun. The name itself bespoke its importance. Daisy felt 200 pairs of eyes on her. Her throat was dry. To hand over the stone and step aside meant condemning Samuel to certain death. A brutal, agonizing death, if the looks on the warriors' faces were any indication. She had saved his life only to serve him up for execution. Yet to refuse was to sign her own death warrant. Samuel took a halting step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her. "The woman is not part of this Goyathle," he said, his voice strained but clear. "She found me dying. She is a healer. Her quarrel is not with you." Goyathle's lip curled in a sneer. She gives shelter to a poisoned snake. She is no better than the snake. The stone. Now. One of the flanking warriors took a step forward, his hand outstretched. Daisy flinched back, pressing the stone to her chest. "Wait," she heard herself say, her voice stronger than she expected. All eyes turned to her. She had their attention. What in God's name was she going to say? He says he wasn't stealing it." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. Goyathle's expression darkened further. "He is a white man," the chief stated, as if that explained everything. "He lies," maybe Daisy said, taking a bold step forward to stand beside Samuel. They presented a united front, the wounded outlaw and the lone woman facing down an army. But he was muttering in his fever. He spoke of another man, a man named Blackwood. He said Blackwood was the one who took the stone. At the mention of the name Blackwood, a subtle but definite change occurred in Goyathle's demeanor. A flicker of recognition of renewed hatred crossed his face. He exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with one of his warriors. He said he was trying to bring it back. Daisy pressed on, her confidence growing. "He was shot running from this Blackwood, not from your people." Samuel looked at her, a mixture of shock and gratitude in his eyes. She was spinning a defense for him from his fevered ramblings. Goyathle considered her words, his dark eyes boring into hers, searching for any hint of deceit. The silence stretched thick and heavy with unspoken threats. The sun was now cresting the mountains, bathing the scene in a cold, golden light. It was the dawn of judgment, and the verdict was yet to be rendered. Finally the chief spoke. "Words are wind. The white man's words are a storm of lies. You have the stone. He is a thief. We have come for justice." He raised his hand, and 200 rifles were raised in unison, their muzzles all pointing at the small cabin. Daisy's heart stopped. This was it. But Goyathle let the word hang in the air, lowering his hand slightly. The rifles remained aimed. "The name you speak, Jedediah Blackwood, is a shadow on our lands, a man who builds his fortune on stolen earth and broken promises. Tell me this story. Tell me why I should not kill you both where you stand and take back what is ours." It wasn't a pardon. It was a stay of execution, a sliver of a chance so thin it was almost invisible. The fate of Samuel Kane and Daisy Moore now rested on a single desperate story. The air was electric, each particle charged with the threat of imminent violence. The muzzles of 200 rifles remained fixed on the cabin, a forest of dark, hollow eyes promising death. Daisy's breath was a knot in her chest. Samuel, leaning heavily against the doorframe, began to speak. His voice, though weakened by his injury, carried the weight of conviction. "Marshal Jedediah Blackwood," he began, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "He's not a lawman. He's a king, building an empire of dust and blood. He's been buying up land, damming streams, pushing ranchers out. But his real goal is the railroad. He's been negotiating with the government to get the main spur line to run through his territory. It would make him the most powerful man in Arizona." Goyathle remained impassive, but his eyes never left Samuel's face. He was listening. To get the route approved, Blackwood needed to prove the land was safe. Pacified, Samuel continued, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. "That meant getting rid of your people, Goyathle. He couldn't risk the Chiricahua raiding the survey crews, so he devised a plan. Not to fight you with soldiers that's too loud, too public. He chose to break your spirit." Samuel paused, taking a ragged breath. "He hired me and my crew a month ago. Said it was for security. A lie. His real target was your winter camp in the Chiricahua Peaks. He had a scout, an Apache traitor named Chaco, who told him about Iye's heart. Told him it was the heart of your tribe's strength your resilience. Blackwood believed that if he stole your spirit, your fight would die with it. A wave of angry murmurs rippled through the warriors. The name Chaco was spit like a curse from several lips. 2 nights ago, under the cover of the new moon, Blackwood and a few of his best men, led by Chaco, snuck into your camp. They didn't kill anyone. They just took the stone. It was supposed to be a ghost raid to make you think the spirits had abandoned you, Samuel explained. I didn't know his plan until it was done. When he showed me the stone, bragging about how he'd neutered the great Goyathle without firing a shot, I knew I'd made a deal with the devil. Daisy watched Samuel mesmerized. This was no fevered rambling. This was a confession, a story told with the stark clarity of truth. Blackwood is a monster, but he isn't stupid, Samuel said, his gaze locking with the chief's. He knows that eventually you'd figure out he was behind it. His plan was to let you rage, let you attack some isolated homesteads or a stagecoach in your anger. Then he'd ride in like a hero, the great Marshal Blackwood, putting down the savage uprising. He'd have his excuse to bring in the cavalry and clear this land for his railroad once and for all. He wanted to use your own strength against you. The pieces fit. The cold, calculating cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a plan that could only be conceived by a man who saw other human beings as mere obstacles on a map. When I realized what he'd done, what he was planning to do, I couldn't be a part of it, Samuel said, his voice dropping. So I took it back. I cracked his head with a pistol butt while he was sleeping, grabbed the stone and rode like hell. I wasn't running from you, Goyathle. I was running from him. I was trying to get the stone back to you before he could set his trap. He gestured weakly with his head. His men shot me as I fled. I was heading for the mountains, hoping to leave the stone where your scouts would find it. But the storm, the wound, I got lost. My horse went lame. I fell here. He finished his story, and the silence that followed was profound. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the basin. Daisy could hear the drip of water from the eaves, the soft stamp of a horse's hoof. Goyathle stared at Samuel, his expression unreadable. He had listened without interruption, a grim statue of contemplation. He was weighing the soul of the man before him. A clever story, the chief said at last, his voice flat. It has the stink of truth about this snake, Blackwood. But you are still a white man who held our heart in his hands. You worked for him. You stood by while he desecrated our sacred ground. Why should I believe your change of heart is anything more than a coward's plea for his life? Because my life is the least important thing here. Samuel shot back, a flash of fire in his eyes. If you kill me, you still don't know Blackwood's full plan. He's not just going to sit back. He wants that stone back, and he wants me dead. He'll be coming. Not with a posse, but with killers. And when he finds your warriors here at this cabin with 2 dead white folk inside, you will have given him exactly the massacre he wants. He'll paint you as the aggressors, the murderers. He wins. Daisy's mind reeled. Samuel was right. Their deaths wouldn't be justice. They would be the trigger for a war the Apache could not win. They were standing at the fulcrum of a terrible, bloody future. It was she who spoke next, her voice clear and steady. She held up the sunstone for all to see. "This is your proof," she said to Goyathle. "Samuel is right. If Blackwood wanted this stone, he'd be hunting him. If he's the man Samuel says he is, he'll be here soon. With his men. He won't let this go." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the grim faces of the warriors. "You want justice. I understand that. But killing us now won't give you justice. It will give Jedediah Blackwood a victory." She then did something incredibly brave, or perhaps incredibly foolish. She walked slowly out of the cabin past Samuel and approached the formidable chief. She stopped a few feet from him, holding out the sunstone on her open palms. "This is yours," she said softly. "It never should have been taken. But taking it back with our blood on it will poison it. It will poison your victory." Goiathle looked from the stone to her face, then to Samuel, who watched with breathless intensity. The chief was locked in a war with himself. His warrior's instinct screamed for vengeance. The desecration demanded blood. But his wisdom, the wisdom of a leader responsible for the survival of his people, saw the terrible logic in their words. He looked up at the sun, now fully clear of the mountains. Its light glinted off the turquoise eye of Ai's heart. He made his decision. "You ask me to trust the word of a hired gun and a woman who protects him?" Goiathle said, his voice like the grinding of stones. "The spirits must think I am a fool." He turned to his warriors, and his voice rose to a commanding bark, speaking in his native tongue. Daisy's heart sank. She thought he was giving the order to fire. Instead, the warriors began to move. But they did not add more. They began to pull back, melting back into the trees and rocks that dotted the basin, their movements fluid and silent. Within a minute, the threatening army that had surrounded the cabin had vanished, becoming an invisible but no less deadly presence. Goiathle turned back to Daisy and Samuel. "You will have your chance to prove this story," he declared. "Marshal Blackwood will indeed come for his prize. When he does, my warriors will be waiting in the shadows to watch." His dark eyes narrowed to slits. "You have until sundown. If this Blackwood and his men arrive, we will see if their intentions are as you say. If they do, you may have bought your lives. But if they do not come, if this has been a clever lie to stall for time, then when the sun sets behind that mountain, my warriors will descend, and this entire cabin will become your funeral pyre." He turned without another word and strode away, vanishing into the trees to join his hidden army. The ultimatum hung in the air: proof or death. Daisy and Samuel were left alone in the sudden, terrifying quiet. They were no longer prisoners, but the bait in a trap, and the clock was ticking down to sundown. The silence that descended after Goiathle's departure was heavier and more menacing than the presence of his army. Daisy and Samuel were acutely aware of the hundreds of unseen eyes watching them from the surrounding woods and rocks. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call seemed like a warning. Daisy finally retreated into the cabin, her knees weak with a mixture of terror and relief. She placed the sunstone on the rough-hewn mantel of the fireplace, where the morning light caught it, making the turquoise center seem to glow with an inner life. Samuel limped in after her, collapsing into the chair by the hearth. The bravado he'd shown before the Apache chief was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. A fresh patch of red was beginning to seep through the bandages at his side. "You need to lie down," Daisy said, her healer's instincts taking over again. "You've torn the wound open." "No time for that," he rasped, shaking his head. "We need a plan. Blackwood will come. The only question is when and how many men he'll bring." "What kind of man is he?" she asked, fetching a dipper of water. Samuel took it with a grateful nod, drinking deeply. "The worst kind. Patient. Smart. He never shows his own hand if he can get someone else to do his dirty work." He looked around the cabin, his eyes assessing its defenses. "He knows this area. He'll likely send a scout first. We need to be ready." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. The sun climbed higher in the sky, a silent, impartial observer counting down the minutes to their deadline. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. Daisy busied herself by cleaning her rifle and checking her ammunition, the simple, repetitive task, a small comfort. Samuel, despite his pain, managed to drag himself to the window, peering out at the landscape, his senses on high alert. He told her more about Blackwood. Jedediah Blackwood had arrived in the territory 3 years ago, a former Pinkerton detective with a sack full of money from some Eastern Railroad baron. He'd secured the position of territorial marshal through a combination of bribes and manufactured fame, having single-handedly taken down a gang of train robbers, a gang that Samuel now suspected Blackwood had hired in the first place. He was a master manipulator, always 3 steps ahead of his enemies. He wants me dead, not just because I took the stone. Samuel said, his gaze fixed on the ridge. But because I know who he is. I know where all the bodies are buried, literally. I'm the one loose end in his perfect plan. As midday approached, the tension became a physical thing, a tightness in the air. Daisy found herself glancing at the sun's position, calculating the remaining time. Sundown. The word was a death knell. It was Samuel who saw him first. There he whispered, his voice sharp. He pointed toward a rocky outcropping a half-mile to the west. Look. Sun reflecting off something. Daisy squinted. At first she saw nothing but rock and scrub. Then she saw it, a tiny, brilliant flash of light. A spyglass. A scout. He's here, she breathed. That's just the appetizer, Samuel said grimly. The main course won't be far behind. They waited. The scout remained in position for the better part of an hour, studying the cabin and the surrounding area. He would see nothing out of the ordinary, a lone cabin, a wisp of smoke from the chimney, a horse in the lean-to. The Apache were masters of concealment. There would be no sign of the army hidden in the trees. Finally, the glint of light vanished. The scout was going back to report. They'll come now, Samuel stated, and they'll come in hard and fast. They'll expect to find me wounded alone. They won't be expecting a fight, just an execution. Another hour passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and gold. The beauty of it was a mockery of their situation. Daisy's hope began to fray. What if Samuel was wrong? What if Blackwood decided to cut his losses, and not come? Goyathle would see it as a lie, and their fate would be sealed. Then they heard it, the distant sound of shod horses on stone, the jingle of bridles, and the low murmur of men's voices. It was a posse. Samuel and Daisy exchanged a look. This was it. The proof had arrived. They came into view from the same western trail the scout had taken. There were 8 of them, riding with the casual arrogance of men who believe themselves to be the predators. At their head was a man on a powerful bay gelding. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, and wore a fine black coat and a silver badge that glinted in the late afternoon sun. He had a neatly trimmed beard and a face that might have been handsome were it not for the cold, cruel set of his eyes. Marshal Jedediah Blackwood Samuel muttered his hand, instinctively going to the Colt peacemaker Daisy had left on the table. Blackwood reined his horse in about 100 yards from the cabin, his men fanning out behind him. He surveyed the scene with an air of ownership. He didn't shout or make any demands. He just sat there waiting. It was a power play, an act of intimidation. One of his men, a weaselly-faced deputy named Miller, rode a few paces forward. Samuel Kane Miller yelled, his voice thin and reedy. "Marshal Blackwood knows you're in there. He just wants to talk. Come on out with your hands high." Samuel let out a short, harsh laugh. Talk. That's a good one. Daisy watched from the window, her heart pounding. The Apache remained hidden. They were waiting, watching, just as Goyathle had promised. They needed to see Blackwood's true intent. "He knows talking won't work," Samuel said to Daisy. "This is for show. He's making it look official before he starts the killing. So if anyone stumbles upon the bodies later, it'll look like he was trying to arrest a dangerous fugitive who resisted." "What do we do?" Daisy asked. "We give him what he wants." Samuel replied, a dangerous light in his eyes, a reason to drop the pretense. He limped to the door, took a deep breath, and shouted, "Blackwood, I know why you're here. It's not in my saddlebag, you murdering bastard. I lost it in the mountains." Blackwood's calm demeanor shattered, his face contorted with fury. The sunstone wasn't just a tool for his plan. It had become a symbol of his power, a prize. The thought of it being lost was unacceptable. "You're lying, Kane." Blackwood roared, his voice a whip crack. "You have it! Miller Finch, go get it! And bring me his head!" The mask was off. This was no lawful arrest. It was a kill order. The two deputies, Miller and Finch, dismounted and began advancing on the cabin, their rifles held at the ready. This was the moment of truth. Daisy looked frantically towards the trees, praying the Apache had seen, had understood. For a terrible second, nothing happened. Blackwood's men were halfway to the cabin. Then, from a thicket of pines to the north, a single arrow flew. It made a sound like a whisper, and it buried itself deep in Deputy Miller's chest. He looked down at the feathered shaft protruding from his shirt, a comical expression of surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. All hell broke loose. The single arrow was a silent promise, swiftly followed by the thunder of its fulfillment. The landscape erupted. From every rock and thicket, Goyathle's warriors rose, as if, from the earth itself, their piercing war cries ripping through the valley. The air moments before still was now thick with arrows and bullets. Marshal Blackwood's posse, so arrogant in their approach, disintegrated into a panicked mob. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. Men who thought they were on a simple execution run found themselves in a masterfully laid ambush. A volley of fire from the trees cut down two more of Blackwood's men before they could even find cover. The hunters had become the hunted. To the rocks return fire. Blackwood's roar was a mixture of fury and shock. A seasoned fighter, he and his remaining men quickly dove behind a large rockfall, using it as a crude fortification. From this position, they laid down a disciplined line of fire, their heavy rifles pinning down the Apache warriors and creating a deadly stalemate. Inside the cabin, bullets thudded against the log walls like angry fists. "Stay down!" Samuel yelled, pulling Daisy away from the window. The fight had ignited a fire in him. The pain in his side was forgotten, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He crawled to the window's edge, his Colt peacemaker steady in his hand, assessing the chaotic scene. Daisy joined him at the other side of the window, her own Winchester held tight. She watched as Blackwood, a figure of cold fury behind a boulder, fired with lethal precision, forcing the warriors to remain concealed. The battle was locked, a deadly balance of power. Suddenly, a burly gunman from Blackwood's crew saw an opportunity. While the main forces were engaged, he broke from cover and made a desperate dash for the cabin's rear, aiming to eliminate the target, Samuel, and break the stalemate. "He's coming for the back!" Daisy cried. There was no time to think. As the heavy thud of the man's shoulder hit the rear wall, she was already moving. The shutter over the small window splintered. Daisy grabbed the heavy wood axe from beside the hearth just as a rifle barrel poked through, followed by the gunman's snarling face. He saw her and hesitated for a fatal second. With a raw cry of fear and fury, Daisy swung the axe with all her strength. The blade met the rifle, shearing through the stock and biting deep into the man's arm. He screamed, stumbling back from the window. That was all the opening Samuel needed. Appearing at Daisy's side, he fired his Colt twice from the doorway. The gunman collapsed into the dirt outside. Panting, Daisy stared at the axe, her knuckles white. A profound and silent understanding passed between her and Samuel. In that moment of shared violence, they were no longer a healer and an outlaw, but partners equals in a desperate fight for survival. Outside, the stalemate continued. Blackwood and his men were pinned, but Goyathle was unwilling to sacrifice his warriors in a costly direct assault. It was then Samuel saw it, the path to victory. In his intense focus on the Apache, Blackwood had left his flank completely exposed to the cabin. "I can end this," Samuel rasped, his eyes glinting. "He won't be looking for me." "You're wounded, you can't—" Daisy started to protest, but he was already moving. "Cover me," he commanded. Before she could argue, he slipped out the front door using the cabin itself as cover. He moved in a low, painful crouch, a shadow making its way toward the rocks where Blackwood was making his last stand. He disappeared from her sight. Daisy's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched the rocks, her rifle ready, praying for a target, for any way to help. The sounds of the main battle seemed to fade as she focused on that one spot. She heard a surprised shout, then a single distinct gunshot from Samuel's Colt, a pause, then one more. A sudden ringing silence fell over the valley. The firing from both sides faltered. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then a figure rose slowly from behind the boulders. It was Samuel. He was swaying, clutching his wounded side, but he was alive. He held Marshal Blackwood's silver-badged coat for a moment before letting it fall to the bloody ground. The battle was over. The surviving posse members, seeing their leader fall, either surrendered or fled into the wilderness. From the trees, Goyathle emerged, his face a mask of grim victory. One by one his warriors came out of their cover, their gazes fixed on the man leaning against the cabin. The unlikely alliance had held. The setting sun cast long shadows over the field of carnage, its crimson light a final, bloody testament to the justice that had been delivered. The silence that followed the battle was profound, broken only by the mournful wind whistling through the pines. The scent of gunpowder and blood tainted the crisp evening air. Goyathle's warriors moved across the blood-soaked ground with a somber efficiency, collecting weapons from the fallen and tending to their own few wounded. The brief, brutal war was over. Daisy was already at Samuel's side, her face a mask of determined focus as she worked to stop the bleeding from his reopened wound. He was pale and weak, leaning heavily against the cabin wall, but his eyes were clear as he watched the aftermath unfold. Goyathle approached them, his presence as powerful as the ancient mountains themselves. He stopped before Samuel, his dark eyes assessing the man's condition. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a hard-earned respect. "You spoke the truth," the chief stated, his voice a low rumble that carried in the quiet. "The snake Blackwood came to kill, and you fought him not as a coward, but as a man defending his home. My warriors saw it." His gaze shifted to Daisy, acknowledging her fierce defense of the cabin, and the healer fought with the heart of a lioness. Goyathle gestured, and a warrior brought him a small deerskin pouch. The chief presented it to Daisy. "You are both owed a debt. These are the people's herbs. They will fight the fire in his blood and mend the flesh. Use them." It was not a suggestion, but a command built on a foundation of respect. With the debt paid, Goyathle strode into the cabin. He stood for a long moment before the mantle where the sunstone rested. He didn't snatch it greedily. He reached out with both hands and took Ayi's heart with a reverence that was a prayer in itself. Holding the sacred object to his chest, a visible weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. The spirit of his people was home. He emerged, the stone secured in a pouch around his neck. He gave Samuel and Daisy a final piercing look. "The debt is settled. From this day, this valley is a place of peace for you. My people will know it and pass by. You are not our enemies." He offered a final grim piece of advice. "But the world beyond this place is still full of snakes." Without another word, he turned and gave a silent command. As quietly as they had arrived, the Apache warriors melted back into the shadows of the mountains. They vanished, leaving Daisy and Samuel alone with the dead and the immense stillness of the coming night. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a welcome comfort. Daisy worked silently, applying the potent Apache herbs to Samuel's wound. He lay on the cot, watching her every move, the intensity in his storm-grey eyes making her feel more seen than she had in years. "You should have let me die in the rain, Daisy Moore," he finally whispered into the quiet. "I'm not very good at doing the smart thing," she replied, a small, weary smile touching her lips. She finished tying the bandage and met his gaze. "What will you do now?" "Blackwood is gone, but his name is still on your wanted poster." He looked around the small, sturdy cabin, at the books on the shelf, the rifle by the door, the woman who had fought an army for him. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a home. "I've been running for so long, I think I forgot what it feels like to stand still," he said, his voice soft. He reached out his hand, gently covering hers. "This place. You. It feels like something worth standing still for." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "I'm good with an axe, and I can handle a rifle if more trouble comes knocking." He paused, his question hanging in the air. "If you'll have me?" Daisy looked at their joined hands. Her world of quiet solitude had been irrevocably shattered, but in its place was a connection forged in the crucible of fire and blood. She had come to the wilderness to be alone, but she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, and a partnership she never knew she needed. The future was a dangerous, unwritten page. But for the first time in a long time, she would not be facing it alone. "The roof needs mending after the storm," she said softly, her answer clear in her eyes. "And I could use some help stacking firewood for the winter." A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. As the first light of a new sunrise began to crest the mountains, it promised not just the start of another day, but the beginning of a new shared life. And so, in the heart of a land that demanded resilience, a story that began with a cry for justice ended with the quiet promise of a new beginning. Daisy and Samuel, thrown together by fate and forged into an alliance by fire, survived the storm. But their journey is far from over. The world beyond their small basin is still filled with shadows, and the past has a long reach. What new challenges will they face? And can a love born from such a violent dawn truly find peace under the western sun? If this story of the untamed West, of unexpected courage, and the complex lines between outlaw and hero captured your heart, let me know. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who loves a real tale of grit and romance. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have so many more stories from the forgotten corners of history to share with you. Thank you for listening.